report confirms the moose population in Minnesota is declining sharply. 30 years ago, in the northwestern part of the state, there were more than 4,000, but tonight there are fewer than 100.
The moose. It is the undisputed king of the North American woods. A creature so large that it stands taller than most humans. But the moose's current reign is a fragile, recent development.
The moose population fell for the 14th straight year.
An alarming decline.
Growing mystery that has scientists baffled and on the hunt for answers.
The moose of Minnesota are dying, and no one knows why.
In the 1800s, unregulated market hunting nearly wiped them out of existence. Their recovery in the 20th century was an unexpected triumph. Yet, in the remote forests of Maine, that triumph began to curdle. Something terrible started happening, slowly at first, and then all at once.
Is there a possibility that there will be no more moose in Minnesota in the foreseeable future?
It's possible. The trajectory really shows we're going to be out of moose by 2025.
The silent slaughter. Hunters, game wardens, and hikers started seeing things that did not fit the normal pattern. They found large bodies lying untouched with no claw marks, no bite marks, and no sign of scavengers. They also saw moose that looked pale, almost washed out against the dark trees, as if their color had been drained. These strange animals would later be called ghost moose, but no one knew that name at the time. All they knew was that something was wrong. Lee Cantar, Maine's lead moose biologist, began collecting these reports. He knew the woods well, and he understood how these stories usually spread.
When she has adult winter ticks on her that are reproducing and are going to lay eggs wherever they drop, we're going to go there.
He expected a few isolated cases. Instead, he saw a steady pattern forming across the district. None of the usual causes fit. There were no new predators. The weather had not shifted in a way that should wipe out so many animals. Something deeper was happening, and the only way to understand it was to gather hard data. In winter 2014-2015, his team carried out a huge, costly operation. They used helicopters to catch and collar dozens of moose calves with GPS radio tags. These collars sent out regular signals showing where each animal was, how fast it moved, and whether it was alive.
In 2014, we started to look at adult cow and calf survival. And we did that by putting GPS collars on adult cows and calves in 2 different management units.
Each ping on the screen was a small sign that the calf was still fighting through the winter. At first, everything looked normal. The dots wandered around the map, showing the usual daily movements of young moose. Then the signals began to stall. One dot after another stopped moving. A flat signal meant the calf had not moved for hours. Once that happened, the chances of survival were almost zero. Teams followed the coordinates through deep snow and rough woods, even when they already knew what they would find. Every time they reached a silent collar, they found another body. Another young moose that had not lived long enough to see spring.
That's smaller than some big bucks that are harvested. And this is live weight, too.
Yeah, this is live weight.
We weigh the moose, which is really critical because we have the weight at capture, so it's live weight at capture, and we weigh it at mortality, and that differential is really important because it tells you the significant amount of weight that this animal can lose.
They kept hoping the numbers would improve as winter went on. They never did. When the season ended, the results came in. Out of 70 calves they had collared, 60 were dead. The survival rate was so low it shook the entire conservation field. Losing 86% of a young population in one winter was a disaster unlike anything they had seen in that region. Whatever was killing these animals worked in the dark, over months, slowly draining the life out of them. And the cause turned out to be something extremely small, shaped by changes humans had unknowingly set in motion. The unlikely assassin. The biologists expected the culprits to be big, wolves perhaps, or a deadly new virus sweeping the herd. But when they examined the bodies, they saw no torn flesh, no broken bones, and no signs of a fast-killing infection. The calves were simply empty. Their bodies were thin, their stomachs had almost nothing in them, and their fat reserves were gone. Then they examined the hide itself. The real cause was right on the animal's skin. The dead moose were covered in a thick layer of tiny moving shapes. Tens of thousands of reddish-brown ticks crawled across their fur. This was the winter tick, Dermacenter albopictus. To understand how deadly these ticks are, we need to look at how they function. These are not the small black-legged deer ticks that spread Lyme disease. Those use several hosts over a long cycle. Winter ticks act in a very different way. They use just one host. They climb onto a moose in the fall, stay on the animal through the entire winter, and feed the whole time. They grow larger with every meal. When spring comes, they drop off to lay eggs and start the cycle again. Their method for finding a host is extremely effective. In late September and early October, the tiny larvae climb onto tall grass and shrubs. They gather in thick clusters, sometimes thousands of them stuck together by their legs, waiting for a large animal to pass. This behavior is called questing. When a moose walks by and brushes the vegetation, the whole cluster jumps onto its fur all at once. This is why a moose can pick up 30,000 to 50,000 ticks in a single day. Some get even more.
You got to think, a moose is a big animal, and we're looking at 10 centimeter, just the lines, just the crease. And still, those moose that are out there alive, the ones that didn't come into harvest, are still acquiring ticks until that shuts down.
One adult cow, known as Moose 59, carried over 90,000 ticks at one time. If someone could scoop off all the swollen ticks and weigh them, the pile would weigh almost as much as a heavy winter backpack. It is almost impossible to picture that many parasites on one body. The numbers explain how the calves die. A single female tick that is full of blood holds about 1 milliliter. Now multiply that by tens of thousands. Over the winter, a moose can lose 40 to 60 liters of blood. The body tries to replace it, but it cannot keep up.
They're an external parasite. They eat on their blood, and they will stay there all for the whole winter, fall and winter on the moose.
When biologists studied the dead calves, they found pale organs and bone marrow that had turned soft and jelly-like instead of waxy and full of healthy fat. This showed the animals had burned through every last reserve trying to make new blood. This creates a three-part breakdown in the calf's body. First, extreme blood loss and starvation. The calf is losing blood every day. Its body puts all energy toward making more. This leaves almost nothing for growth or survival. Many calves lost almost a quarter of their body weight by the time winter ended. Second, loss of body heat. The itch from the ticks is overwhelming. The moose scratches against trees and rocks until its thick guard hairs break off. Those outer hairs are hollow and help trap heat. Without them, warm air escapes and the animal has to burn even more calories to stay warm. Third, slow, steady death from blood loss. This ongoing drain pushes the young moose past the point where recovery is possible. Moose do not have a natural defense against these ticks. They are much newer to North America and did not evolve alongside this specific parasite. They are simply not built for this fight. In the ecological sense, they are evolutionarily naive, meaning they have no learned or inherited protection. They cannot stop the attack once it begins. The tick kills with numbers, and those numbers grow faster when the world around it changes. The perfect storm. The winter tick has been in the Maine woods for millennia. It is a native species. So why is it only now a biological weapon? The answer lies in a combination of two massive human factors: climate change and land use. Together, they created the perfect ecological storm. For many years, the natural protection for moose was the early freeze. A cold October with quick snow cover used to stop most of the tick larvae before they could ever reach a host. When snow arrived early, it buried the larvae and ended the questing season fast. The shorter the window, the fewer ticks survived, and the more calves lived through the winter. But now the seasons have shifted. The Northeast has warmed by approximately 2 degrees Fahrenheit since the late 1800s, with most warming occurring after 1970. It does not sound like a big change to a person, but for a tick, that small rise changes everything. The early frost often comes late. Snow that once fell in October may now fall weeks later or not at all until deep into November. This stretch of extra time gives larvae a much longer chance to get onto a host. Instead of 2 or 3 weeks of questing, they now have 2 or 3 months. First frost now appears 3 decades later than it did decades ago. That expansion alone is enough to multiply the number of ticks by huge margins. A longer fall is basically a longer feeding season. The warmer climate has opened the door for the tick to spread in a way it never could before. The second major factor comes from how the forests were managed. Parts of northern Maine were heavily logged in the 1990s and early 2000s. Large clear-cuts opened the land and allowed the forest to start over. When these areas grew back, they were filled with young shrubs and fresh plants that moose loved to eat. This created a wide stretch of perfect feeding space. With more food and fewer predators left on the land, the moose population grew fast. Some areas that once had 10 or 15 moose per 10 square miles were now holding 40. This heavy crowding made it easy for the ticks to spread. When many animals gather in a small area, parasites grow even faster. This pattern is called density dependence, where the size of a population affects how much danger it faces. In simple terms, the moose population became too large for the area. The land could feed them, but it also turned into the ideal breeding ground for ticks. The animals walked into what looked like a healthy forest, not knowing that every bite of fresh growth also helped build the conditions that would harm them. And the moose, with no evolved defense and too many bodies in one place, found themselves trapped in a cycle they could not escape. Maine's forests had become perfect for the parasite and deadly for the host. A specter in the woods. One of the clearest signs of the crisis is the appearance of the ghost moose. When the itching becomes too much to bear, the animals rub against trees, rocks, and branches until their thick, dark coat tears away. This exposes a pale underlayer that looks almost white from a distance. In the snowy winter woods, these animals stand out sharply, looking drained and worn down. But the pale coat is more than a strange sight. It is a sign that the moose is breaking down. Their winter coat is built to trap heat and keep them alive in freezing temperatures. Once the outer hairs are gone, warm air slips out of the body fast. The animal then burns extra calories just to stay warm. Those calories should have gone toward healing, growing, or replacing lost blood. Instead, they are used up fighting the cold. A ghost moose is weak, tired, and in pain. Anyone who sees one knows it has already lost most of its strength. The problem goes beyond calf deaths. It also affects the next generation. A calf that survives a heavy tick season is often small, thin, and underdeveloped.
And the answer is not increasing moose. The answer is to have less of those moose to break the tick cycle so you don't have these calves taking the bulk of it.
These young moose are not strong enough to become healthy adults. Even if they are alive, their bodies carry the effects of starvation and blood loss. This reduces their chances of living long enough to breed. Adult cows that survive a bad infestation often do not carry enough energy to get pregnant, or if they do, they may lose the pregnancy early. Moose 59 is a clear example. She survived a massive tick load, but her body was so drained afterward that she miscarried. This creates a two-sided collapse. Together, these forces push the population downward at a speed that shocks researchers. The herd enters a slow death spiral, where each year begins with fewer healthy animals than the year before. And Maine is not the only state seeing this trend. New Hampshire has had winters where calf mortality reached 70% in some regions. Vermont's moose population has fallen by more than 60% since the year 2000. All of this follows the warming climate line northward. Where the climate shifts, the ticks follow. The moose, known for its strength and size, now faces a threat that drains it without sound or speed. An animal built for cold forests is now trying to survive in an environment that has changed in ways it cannot adapt to fast enough. The ghost moose is the living symbol of that struggle. It shows what happens when a strong species is pushed past its limit by small, rising changes in the world around it. The grim calculus. The biologists were faced with a grim calculus. How do you save the moose when the root cause is global climate change? They couldn't change the weather, but they could change the landscape. The solution they settled on was shocking and deeply controversial. To save the moose, they had to reduce their numbers. The strategy was based on sound ecological science, density dependence. Since the high number of moose was directly fueling the tick population, the only way to break the cycle was to starve the ticks. They had to reduce the number of available hosts. In recent years, they implemented a radical experiment. They sectioned off Wildlife Management District 4. In one half, the control zone, they left hunting permits as they were. In the other half, the cull zone, they drastically increased the permits for antlerless moose, cows, and calves. It was a tough conversation. Hunters and conservationists argued that killing healthy moose to save them seemed counterintuitive. But the science held firm. It was a choice between a large, sick, and dying population and a smaller but ultimately healthy breeding population. Quality over quantity. The early results were compelling. In the experimental cull zone, calf survival rates improved significantly, and the tick counts on the surviving moose dropped. Reducing the host population was, in fact, the only viable method to break the parasitic cycle. They had looked into other solutions. Using chemical collars that released tick-killing agents worked in trials, reducing tick zones substantially. But as a practical solution for a vast, remote herd, it was impossible. You cannot catch and collar tens of thousands of wild animals every year. The grim calculus was confirmed. To have healthy moose, we must accept having fewer moose. This is the hard, new reality of conservation. The story of the moose is more than a local wildlife crisis. It is a profound, chilling warning for the rest of the world. It shows how the slightest shift in the climate, a few degrees, a few weeks of delayed frost, can unlock a biological monster. It proves that human choices, both in land use and climate impact, have weaponized native species against America's largest animals. To fix the environment we've broken, we must now be prepared to make the tough, uncomfortable decisions. The future of the North American woods depends on it. The other ghosts. The winter tick isn't the only parasite threatening the moose. While the winter tick is the greatest killer on the northern edge of the moose's range, the crisis further south reveals a more complex and equally terrifying biological threat: brainworm. For years before the tick crisis reached its current horrific scale, biologists in states like Minnesota, Michigan, and the southern reaches of New England had noticed a different kind of neurological collapse in moose. These animals weren't pale and scratched. They were confused, stumbling, and fearless of humans. They would walk in circles, have glazed eyes, or exhibit a peculiar head tilt. This was the deadly work of Parelophostrongylus tenuis, a tiny parasitic nematode commonly known as the brainworm or meningeal worm. The brainworm is a parasite that, like the winter tick, relies on another animal, the white-tailed deer, to complete its life cycle. The deer is the definitive host. The adult worms live harmlessly on the surface of the deer's brain, reproduce, and their larvae are passed out in the deer's feces. The next critical step in the cycle involves a third tiny host: snails and slugs. These gastropods ingest the larvae from the deer feces, and the larvae develop into their infectious stage. The cycle is complete when the deer accidentally ingests an infected snail or slug while browsing on vegetation. The deer is resistant, so the cycle continues, stable and silent. However, the moose is an aberrant host. When the moose accidentally ingests that same infected snail or slug while eating, the brainworm larvae lose their way. Instead of settling benignly, they migrate aggressively through the moose's central nervous system, the spinal cord, and brain. This neurological damage causes the debilitating symptoms: incoordination, weakness, paralysis, and eventually a slow, agonizing death. The brainworm crisis reveals a secondary level of ecological disruption. Like the tick, the brainworm's range is expanding due to climate change. Warmer winters and milder conditions allow the intermediate hosts, the slugs and snails, to survive and remain active for longer periods, expanding the parasite's range northward. But the central issue here is the expansion of the white-tailed deer population. Historically, the northern boreal forests were too harsh for deer to thrive in large numbers. Moose and deer populations were segregated. However, Forest clearing, milder winters, and a lack of predators have allowed deer populations to boom and push further into moose territory. This creates a deadly intersection. In areas with high deer density, the ecological stage is set for an endemic brainworm threat. Biologists estimate that majority of deer in endemic regions are infected, providing a constant deadly source of larvae that is rapidly making the southern fringe of the moose range uninhabitable. For the moose, the crisis isn't one-dimensional. It's a two-front war: the winter tick in the north, weaponized by climate-extended autumns, and the brainworm in the south, following the advance of the white-tailed deer. Both parasites are forcing the moose into an ever-shrinking sliver of northern habitat. A global warning. The moose is a symbol, a draw for visitors, and the heart of an entire local economy built on hunting, wildlife tours, and nature trips. People travel from all over the country and from other parts of the world to catch even one sighting of this huge animal. Small towns in northern Maine, Vermont, and New Hampshire depend on this. Motels, small restaurants, gas stations, and guiding businesses all rely on the moose to bring steady income. The controlled moose hunt, though much smaller than deer hunting, is also important. Hunters wait years for a chance at a permit. These permits bring in thousands of applicants and provide key funding for state wildlife agencies. That money helps pay for research, habitat work, and conservation programs. When the moose population drops, the number of hunting permits drops too, and the whole funding system falls apart. But the meaning of the moose goes far beyond money. For the Wabanaki Confederacy, the indigenous nations of the Northeast, the moose is a relative.
Moose represent Maine, to me, you know? They really do. They're a big symbol of what Maine is.
It is tied to their food, their traditions, their stories, and their identity. When the moose declines, it affects their connection to the land in ways that cannot be measured with numbers. And for many people across New England, the moose stands for the wild, untamed character of the region. Its loss feels personal. The difficult wildlife plan used in Maine, reducing the number of moose to save the species, is now becoming a common response to climate-driven problems across the world. The moose now shows how climate change can turn a familiar native parasite into a deadly force. It shows how a small shift in temperature can overturn an entire ecosystem. Climate change does not need new threats to cause damage. It only needs to strengthen the ones already here. Can we accept the reality that saving the moose now requires human action? Reducing their numbers is a form of interference. Changing how forests are logged to create better shade and fewer dense feeding patches is also interference. But without these steps, the species will continue to collapse. The future of the northern forests now depends on our willingness to manage a landscape that has been pushed out of balance. We must choose carefully, making decisions that may feel heavy but necessary if we want to protect what remains. The fight to protect the moose is really the fight to protect every ecosystem under climate pressure. If the king of the Northwoods can be undone by something this small, then the natural world is now at risk.